Hi everyone, welcome to this week's review video for what we discussed in our evangelism class this week. For those of you who were in class but would like to see a little review, for those of you who may have missed class this past week, and for those of you who are following along our course here on this page. So let me just quickly walk through what we did in case you weren't there and would like to know what was said. We began reviewing an article that I had students read by the priest and theologian British named Martyn Percy. And the piece I had the class read, of course, was called Making Franciscans. And I won't review it here because we've discussed it in these videos and also in class before. But the thumbnail sketch is basically that about 25 or 30 years ago, when Martyn Percy was doing his field work, when he was a seminary student, he was sent to the north of England to work in a working class, mostly Muslim community that had just been depressed by so many of the economic changes and industrialization and fights with unions and things like that were going on in the north of England at the time. And he noticed two different ministries that were tried while he was there. And one of them was a group of people, think of like a Billy Graham crusade kind of organization. We have them here in this country as well, but they call them presentation ministries or parachurch organizations. And one of them in England had chosen this town to open up a kind of ministry site, but with hopes to really convert a lot of the population either from Islam to Christianity or unchurched people to become churched people. And according to Martyn Percy, they were there for a year or two, maybe three, and they sort of set up shop and were handing out tracts and trying to start conversations with people about God. And they tried giving things away, everything from food to clothing to money, to any kind of services that the community might need. But there was never any real traction, to use their word, for the preaching of the gospel the way that they were doing it. And he said really by the end of about 2 or 3 years, the whole organization sort of packed up and left the city, and found that people just weren't receptive to receive the gospel. He compared that to a group of Franciscan brothers who had already taken a number of vows, including poverty. And those brothers moved, a small group of them, just a handful, moved to that town and decided that they were going to live there. And that's what they felt called to do, is to go and to live under their rule of life as Franciscans, but basically as Christians in that particular neighborhood. And they came with almost nothing, they really just had the clothes on their back and the food that they were able to bring with them. But they had sort of an open door policy and were very friendly and let people know that they had moved there. And they started they shared what they had with the community, but it wasn't very much. And according to Martyn Percy, after just a few days, the community itself became aware that these Franciscans had moved to that village, and that they needed things. And people actually in the community brought gifts to the Franciscans, seeing that they didn't really have a lot of food, they had no furniture. And one of the wonderful stories that Martyn Percy tells is that there was a very working class family that came and brought the back seat of an old car for them to use as a couch. So it had picture like an old leather bench seat from a car, and they'd just taken it out of an old car and they'd brought it so that the Franciscans had somewhere to sit. And the Franciscans with humility and gratitude just really accepted the gifts of the people. And they continued to live among these people and take care of exactly where they lived and then the street that they lived on. And they built relationships with people. And of course, they opened up their lives of prayer and Christian discipleship and formation to the community, offering invitations to meals, to ask for prayer requests and things like that. But they didn't have any of the approach that the kind of more evangelical, born-again Christian organization had in that community. The brothers really just came to the community and decided to live as Christians in that community and to see what God would do with their witness. Now they, of course, were prepared, as the scripture says, to give an answer for the hope that they had. They didn't by any means hide their Christianity. Quite the reverse. It was God in whom they lived and moved and had their being. They believed that if the community got to know them as people in whom God lived and moved and had their being, that the people would get to know God. And if they had questions, of course, the Franciscans were there to offer any answers, or anything from an answer to a question all the way to an invitation to a kind of a catechumenate if people were interested in becoming Christians. Well, you can imagine where the story goes, and according to Martyn Percy, those Franciscan brothers, and more than one generation of them, are still there decades later in that community, and are some of the most trusted community members in this still majority Muslim community. And Martyn Percy compares these two kinds of evangelism. And it's not that one was with words and one was not. That's too simple. Think of something even like gifts. The evangelicals came and were giving things away and turned it into a kind of charity. So the idea was that they were arriving with resources, and the assumption then was the community didn't have resources, and that's what it looked like when they sort of showed up and just gave things away. Whereas the Franciscans showed up as human beings with needs. And that sent an entirely different message to the community. It let the community know that the community was a place of abundance and gift. And that the community saw that the Franciscans trusted that they were coming to a loving place with people that they wanted to partner with in bringing about peace and justice and love in the community. So instead of showing up and letting people know you don't have things, so we're here, whether it's the gospel or paper towels, we're here to give it to you, the Franciscans showed up and said, we are humans like you are, and there are things that we have to give, and there are things that we need. And immediately it marshaled the community's resources and sense of abundance, and sense that they had been gifted by God. And they had things to share. So of course the gifts came to the Franciscans rather than them setting up some kind of distribution site where they were giving things away. Now, as you can imagine, whenever the Franciscans had anything that was extra, I can imagine that they gave those things to the community. But they also received from the community. So think of not just the things like paper towels or money that went in a very different direction with the Franciscans than with the other born-again Christian ministry, but think of the gospel itself. So with the first group, they showed up with this idea that they were going to bring Christ, or they were going to bring the gospel to the city. The assumption being that the gospel wasn't already there. Just like by bringing food and money, your assumption is that people didn't have it. But by the Franciscans showing up and believing instead that God had gone before them, that because of the incarnation, Christ is in all places. By the way, we take a baptismal vow to seek and serve Christ in all persons. We don't take a vow to plant Christ or bring Christ to all persons, but to seek and serve. That's what the Franciscans went there to do. They assumed that the Lord had gone before them and that they would meet Christ in that community. And they were grateful. And in that sense, the community had that, they were sort of, that they felt that they had been assessed as having abundance and even grace in the community the moment the Franciscans arrived ready to receive the gifts that they believed God had already given that community. So I threw this out because it's discussed in an essay by Martyn Percy, and he's trying to say what he thinks has gone wrong the last few decades with evangelism in the Church of England and very much in the United States as well. He talks about the decade of evangelism. Remember that's what we called from 1990 to 2000, all across the Anglican Communion. And Martyn Percy points out that in many ways this decision to have a decade of evangelism was not as much that the church felt called to identify and make people aware of Christ across the earth, but it was much more a fearful reaction of the existential crisis that mainline Protestantism and the Anglican Church in particular across the world could see coming. Membership numbers of churches going lower and lower. And according to Martyn Percy, this really developed a kind of a dark spirit about evangelism, that it was a kind of just a reactionary move, an act out of fear that the church was declining to the point of existential crisis. And he said what happened both in the decade of evangelism and after, remember the church in different parts of the world, especially in the European church, the United States, the decade of evangelism, the church went down 10, 15, in some areas 20% loss at the end of the decade of evangelism. And Martyn Percy's argument about this is that it's because he said the church went into broadcast mode. And what he means by this is not changing its relationship to the world or beginning to pray about how the Holy Spirit might be asking the church to do a new thing, but instead that the church really decided the problem was that they weren't saying enough, or they weren't saying it loudly or in enough places. Think of social media, which really wasn't an issue at the time of the decade of evangelism, but that idea if we could just communicate on more platforms. He said basically the church turned up the volume on a message that hadn't changed theologically that much since prior decades or even prior centuries, of this idea that that first group of ministers had that went to that city in the north, this idea that they were going to bring God or bring the gospel or bring Christ to some godless place. So he really believed that message really didn't change in the decade of evangelism, and since people just sort of turned up the volume and started to work more on the public relations of churches or finding ways to communicate outside the walls of your church. But according to Percy, the actual DNA of the message hadn't changed. It was still what was a horrible phrase known as the white man's burden, this terrible colonial idea for centuries that the church was trapped in, that it had the burden of going into the world and bringing God to places where God hadn't been. And when they got there, if the people weren't receptive, to sort of make sure that people either agreed or succumbed to their message. So Martyn Percy says we just sort of cleaned up that message in the 90s and the early 2000s and turned up the volume on hospitality and kindness, but we really didn't rethink the theology, which showed up and let people know that they didn't have something that we, the colonizers or the missionaries, had. So his point is actually a joyful one, which is there's an invitation right now for us to move from the broadcasting church. Well, let me back up. To move from this idea of the burden that we have to bring God places, and then moving into the 90s and the 2000s, this idea of the broadcast church, he's inviting us to do a new thing. In my own book, I suggest that if we've gone from burden to broadcast, that I've said that we need a third B, that we really need to move to is blessing. From burden to broadcast to blessing. And blessing is the word that I actually felt when I read originally Martyn Percy's essay about the Franciscans, that what they did when they arrived, full of the gospel, fully aware that they would meet God where they went, that kind of presence was a blessing to that community. And it did raise people's curiosity for what the Franciscans were about, for what Christians were about. But they weren't threatened by it. They were simply invited to understand the abundance that came in the lives of the Franciscans and the abundance they discovered in their own lives when they entered into a truly mutual relationship with the Franciscans, feeling themselves loved as neighbors and feeling empowered to love and serve and gift the Franciscans who were their neighbors. So I call that blessing and think that that's really an opportunity for the church right now, that we move into ministries of evangelism that are based not in broadcasting or in some kind of burden, but in blessing. So then we moved in class to talk about what kind of theology explains this approach to evangelism that we could call blessing. And I introduced two different clips from the video series, a wonderful video series on evangelism called Embracing Evangelism, that the Church Center put together in cooperation with Virginia Theological Seminary. And all of those, there's six versions, 6 videos, and I took just a clip from one of them, the clip that explains the incarnational theology of the Anglican tradition in the Episcopal Church, and then there's a short kind of a whiteboard cartoon that explains our theology of evangelism and what it means to be a post-colonial evangelist that does what I call blessing evangelism, which isn't to say that we don't care what other people believe or that we don't believe that we're called to give an answer for the hope that we have and to baptize all. But it does mean that we have a theology of the whole creation that helps us not enter a community ready to convince or convert, but that we enter a community rather to enter into shared life. And then the abundant life that is in us will be experienced by the people we meet. At the end of this video, I've put the 2 clips that I showed in class. If you're just using this video now as a review of what went on in class, I didn't want to stop and take the minutes to watch that video, but stick with this video if you want to see those clips at the end. Again, one explains our understanding of the incarnation, that Christ is in fact in all creation, that the resurrection is an experience available at this very second all throughout creation, and how that means we're not bringing that experience to other people, but the way we live our lives can make people more aware of that presence of Christ that is in all and through all. So after we talked about the incarnational theology that allows us to be evangelists that see ourselves as blessing the world with the gospel, rather than sort of imposing the gospel on places that it wasn't or on people who aren't interested, that we think instead of blessing the world with our lives, blessing the world with the gospel, and then seeing what God does with our witness. We then talked about something called the cultural mandate. And some people in class had never heard of the cultural mandate, and other people who'd studied systematic theology had heard this phrase before. And Episcopalians and Anglicans were not the only Christians to hold this theological idea of the cultural mandate, but I've always believed that it's really a crown jewel in the Episcopal tradition. And if you haven't heard of it before, I hope it's something that really gives you life, because although, as I say, other Christians of other denominations also hold this as a tenet of their systematic theology, I believe there's something about the cultural mandate as an idea that particularly animates the Anglican tradition and the Anglican sacramental imagination. So if you haven't heard this phrase before, the cultural mandate is a phrase that's used to interpret a group of verses in the Bible that explain the relationship of the people of God to the cultures outside or adjacent to the people of God. And the most profound verse of the idea of the cultural mandate, of course, is Genesis 1:28. And this is after the fall in the Garden of Eden. It's when Adam and Eve are leaving the garden, and God, rather than sort of yelling at them and cursing them as they leave, God says, the book says, God blessed them. God blessed them on their way and told them to go out and to be fruitful and multiply. So it's not like they're put in time out when they leave the garden. They have left paradise. And by choosing to go their own way rather than go the way of God, they have, in a sense, walked away from a relationship with God that was just an unmediated experience of God's grace and God's will, because they wanted their own. But God doesn't send them out of the garden, again, cursed. And without resources, in this case, without blessing. God sort of lays out the creation in front of them and blesses them on their way. And the idea is, by telling them to be fruitful and multiply, that's been interpreted as the cultural mandate, as God saying, go forth into the world, not as a shamed, fallen humanity, but as co-creators. You are the bearers of the image of God, because both, as it says earlier in Genesis, both of them were created in God's image. In God's image, they were created. So they're image bearers, and they're meant to go out and be fruitful. That is to say, have more image bearers populate the earth. There are negative interpretations too. We can't at all ignore that in those verses as well, where it says that they're to have dominion over the earth and things like that, that part of that mandate has not been to embrace culture or to build culture or to make a world that itself is in the image of God. We can't deny the fact that there was also, along with the cultural mandate, often interpreted a mandate of dominion, of conquering the physical world, the natural world. And we can see the destruction of creation that has come from that interpretation. And for that reason, there are many Christian traditions that don't want to talk about any kind of mandate that comes out of Adam and Eve leaving the garden. But in the Anglican tradition, we hold on to this idea that, yes, great damage has been done with this idea that we were somehow given the keys to creation, and then we could sort of pillage the earth or any peoples upon the earth. That's definitely there. We have to be aware of that. But sort of embedded in the same group of verses, I think, is a criticism against that. When God says to be fruitful and multiply, that is to say, have human flourishing, not in an antagonistic relationship with creation, symbolized in the apple or the tree or the serpent, but no, go out and live into the creation and be an image of God bearer in the creation. So people see this as an invitation to create art, language, culture, traditions, storytelling, not just cultural identities, but cultural convictions about things like democracy or human rights. All of this can flow from what's called the cultural mandate. Now, there are some other verses that also fall into the idea and the understanding in Scripture of cultural mandates. One would be Jeremiah 29:1. When the prophet says to the people, remember, they're in Babylon, right? They're in this exile, and the question is, what do the people of God do in this exile? Do they sort of hunker down and just really stay to themselves and just wait until they can return to their promised land? And what Jeremiah says to the people from God is, go forth, go out, plant seeds in the fields, have interactions with the city. And he has this wonderful phrase from God where it says, because you'll find in the shalom, in the peace of the city, you will find your own peace. This is a place where God, he says, has brought us, and God is with us. And we are meant to trust that we are called by God and that we are with God and that we can engage even out here in exile. So it isn't a retreat from the culture. Jeremiah says the same thing that God really says to Adam and Eve in our great mythic story in Adam and Eve, which is to go forth. So yes, exile is a broken situation, just like what happened in the garden was a broken situation. But don't kind of hide under a rock. This is, again, the cultural mandate, the call to go forth, and not only to bless the city, as it says in Jeremiah, but to realize that we have an interest in the cities in which God has brought us, and we should fight for the shalom of the city, because that peace isn't different than the peace we'll enjoy in our lives, that we're inextricably connected to the peace of the people around us, and we should be working for it, and working with the city for it. Again, another invitation to be fruitful and multiply. it's kind of fun when you start thinking about what other verses you've read that you would think fall into this idea of sacramental Christianity. That is to say, our relationship is not church or world, or church versus world, but church and world. That we're called into relationships, into the materiality and to the cultures around us. I personally have always thought of the Acts passage about Pentecost as being another set of verses that I would include in the understanding of cultural mandates being sent forth, blessed by God to engage the world, not to hide from it or hold back from it, thinking that we'd be made impure if we did that. Because think of what happens in the Pentecost miracle. Remember, the miracle that happens is not that the followers of Jesus, all of a sudden, while they were speaking Aramaic or Greek or whatever their languages were, could be understood by everyone from all these other cultures who then was able to understand Aramaic or Greek. Remember, that's not what happened. What happened was the disciples took up the languages of all the cultures that were around them on that day of Pentecost. People from Crete or Phrygia or anything, or Pamphylia or things like that. So I see that as a sort of a cultural mandate, because on that day, God blessed the cultures and the languages that were different from the followers. Sort of the Holy Spirit literally took up the tongues, took up the languages of people outside the followers of Jesus. I mean, can you think of any more of a mandate to go forth the next hour, the next day, the next decade from that moment and continue to speak Cretan and Phrygian and all the languages of the people who understood the story of Jesus on that day? So think in your own life. Any passage that you can come up with that you think, upon reflection, isn't just a passage that talks about mission, but it's a passage that upholds this idea of the sacramental Christian, of the Anglican or the Episcopal imagination and identity, which is that we look to the world not as an adversary, but we look to the world believing first that the incarnation means we will meet Christ in the world when we go out. Go out anything, your room, your house, your church, your community, your campus ministry, your prison, your hospital, that as we go forth from these places, that we will meet God. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, when we meet God, we're not meant to withhold or to protect our own beliefs or ideas, but we're meant instead to hear a mandate that says, be fruitful and multiply, because in the peace of the city, you'll find your own. In the peace of the seeker or the unchurched or non-churched person or atheist next to you, if you seek their peace, you are seeking your own, because every good and perfect gift comes from God, as the scripture says. And the last idea that we talked about, because we talked about the Anglican imagination for the fact that the incarnation is in all places and that we should go out into the world expecting to meet Christ in all people. But the problem a lot of people started to bring up in class is, well, what do you do with evil? I mean, it's all well and good to say we go out into the world and we're looking for God, and to be an evangelist means to bless people as listeners, and as people who are people of hope and of joy and of a belief in the defeat of death through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But then what do you do when you just encounter people or situations of horrible darkness and evil, of oppression and racism, of violence and crime, of bigotry? How do we face that? And then we started talking about different ways to think or to talk about evil as an evangelist, as someone who goes out into the world, not just to talk about the gospel, but to try to live it the way the Franciscans did in that city in the north of England. To sort of trust that the gospel is in you, and that if you then open yourself up to listen and to love and to learn about the people around you, that they are going to experience Christ in you. But again, what do you do and how do you talk about evil with people when that is their presenting issue? It's not that they don't believe you, that you have joy or hope, but they are experiencing something that is physical or structural. It could be health related, it could be economic, it could be something like crime or oppression or violence. And what I did was I asked some people in the class what their ideas were about how we talk philosophically and theologically about evil. And I gave a couple of images and some ideas. There's a lot of great books you can read about this, of course, and the book that I've suggested in our course is called Episcopal Questions, Episcopal Answers. And it's written by Chuck Robertson, who's one of the canons to the presiding bishop at the Church Center, and also the co-author is Ian Markham, who's the dean of Virginia Theological Seminary. And they've put together this book, Episcopal Questions, Episcopal Answers, that is a very approachable, very readable book, and it's definitely worth having or making sure that people in your leadership team in your ministry or your parish habit. And it's not the kind of thing maybe that you read from page 1 to the end, but it organizes so many different kinds of questions that people of faith get asked, and it gives you a very clear, solidly Episcopal answer to them, sometimes with humor, some great metaphors in there, but it's a wonderful book. And there's sections, of course, on evil in that book. But what I said about evil was, I went back to Augustine and talked about what Augustine said was the privation of the good. And that was a phrase that some people had heard of and some people hadn't heard of. And Augustine makes a very important point. And although, of course, there's been so many centuries since then of Christians and theologians thinking about evil, but Augustine brings up a point that I think is worth meditating on. And it is this, that evil itself is not a creation of God. And we shouldn't struggle to explain to ourselves or to other people why God would create evil. Technically speaking, this is not a very fulfilling answer just yet, but give me a moment. Technically speaking, according to Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and theologians since then, we do not believe that evil is a substance that God has created. We believe evil is insubstantial. Now, you and I are a substance. We are something created, life created by God, love, grace, the physical world. We believe these are creations of God. They have substance. And according to Augustine and theologians since, evil does not have that. Now, for a person's suffering or struggling against evil in themselves, around them, both, that's a pretty unfulfilling answer, because boy, evil certainly feels real. It feels like a substance, as it takes life and limb from people and freedom. But what I mean when I say that evil is not a substance, again, I want to be very clear, it's that God did not create evil, but you look around and you see it, so you say, so where did it come from? And this is Augustine's idea of what he calls the privation of the good, privatia boni. And the idea is that if you think of creation as like a jug of water, and think of it as full. So at the beginning of time, the great story of Genesis says that God created the world and it was good. In fact, on the last day of creation, it says it was very good. So think of that. That's the creation. Everything God has made in it, it is God who says this is very good. That's our belief about the created world. But what happens is we are created in the image of God, in that jug, are human beings who in God's image have God's freedom. So yes, what was created was good, entirely, thoroughly, completely, unfiltered good. But also the ability for us to be co-creators, to use our own agency and choice, to create things within the created order. And this word privation, it's this really fancy theological word, what it means to, when you private something, you shrink it. So think of something as public, sort of spreading out, but if you private something, you sort of make it smaller. So the idea is, of all the good that God created, we had the power to either add good to it, acting as the image of God, with the power of God to continue to create. Remember in Genesis, God says, you name the animals. God could have named the animals in that great mythic story, but that verse includes this Jewish and Christian wisdom that God sort of gives over some of the living on earth with us. So God makes the animals and we name them. That's seen as a verse that demonstrates the partnership that goes on to this day. But we can also introduce then, because we are free in God's image, things into creation that God did not create, that God's will did not will to be at the beginning of time as something that would be good or very good. And every time we make choices, and they get inherited generation after generation, whether they affect the body or the society or the soul, that we can actually take all of the good that filled creation and we can shrink it. Think of there now being kind of an open space. We have this huge jug that was all full of water, but we have the ability to sort of bring down the level of good by introducing things into creation that were not out of God's love or out of God's creation. They were out of our creation. And that process by which our presence in creation can actually private, can shrink the good that could or that exists in creation by either breaking things that are good or not bringing into creation things that are good, that when then we private the good. And we call that space, that air that opens up as we bring down the level of goodness, because we have the power to do it with our free will, we call that space evil, the vacuum of good. Now, again, that's a good philosophical, Thomas Aquinas gives paragraphs and whole chapters in his writing to explain philosophically why this makes perfect sense, that evil is something we experience, but it's not a real thing that God created. Well, that is no comfort to someone who is struggling with evil, and it certainly doesn't help them understand how they're going to endure the struggle against evil, again, within themselves, that they're victims of, that they make other people victims of, or all of that together. So the image that I gave the class, I said, if you take a piece of rope, think of rope as something that has been created. It is a good, it's a very good thing, let's say, that God has created. But then there's something that we speak of as a knot. Now, once you tie a knot, it is a real thing. This knot, it did not exist before, but it exists now. And any of you have ever tried to take a knot out of think of like a necklace, if you wear, men or women, and it's a very thin chain, and if you get a knot in it, you could just sit for hours trying to get the knot out, or something larger like this. These knots can make you feel like that they can never be taken out, that all you can do is just sort of cut the rope. But here's the thing, if you ever do come across a knot and you have a physical experience of it in space and time, you're never going to say that this is not real. But once a knot is untied, the knot no longer exists. Because the knot was not a thing like the rope. It was an arrangement that someone could make with the rope and then create a real thing. But in time, you can actually undo the arrangement, and what you now have still is what was created, but you no longer have the thing that was arranged by someone with free will. And strictly speaking, this is one way to think about the sort of broad church Christian theological understanding of evil. That we are, yes, that their evil is almost in every part of the human experience. We meet these knots, we make these knots, we leave these knots undone, done and undone. But there will be, in our belief, a time and a place in the last days of judgment and of Christ's second coming, that all knots, all things will be made new, a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth, and tears wiped away. That those aren't just phrases to make people feel better. That is the deep content of Christian hope. And if you look up Christian hope in the Catechism, also known as the Outline of the Faith at the end of the prayer book, there's a whole section on Christian hope. And it's our belief in the second coming, that every single knot that has been created, ones that we understand how they were created and others that we seem to just inherit and not understand, and that we experience as so real in the world. Our deep conviction is that at the beginning of time, there were not those knots. What was created was good. It was very good. It was for the liberation and dignity of all parts of creation. But freedom was part of being in the image of God. And as a result, knots have been tied. And we believe much work can be done in justice and in prayer and in transformation, that we can be salt and light and leaven in the world. This invitation that Christ gives all of us, not just to be in the world, but to change the world and let the Christ that is in us have that effect on everyone we meet and everywhere we go, as individuals and as the church community throughout the world. But we believe very strongly, and this kind of what's called eschatology is so important to Christian hope, that we're not going to keep trying to work on knots as human beings in every generation and have some success in some generations and have steps back in other generations. And sometimes it feels like the knots are growing faster than any human effort can undo them. But remember, we take on this hard work knowing that there will be a time when this work will be taken from us. And what the second coming largely is the completion of the redemption of the world, which is the freedom of any rope from any knot that any person or any culture or any time period has ever imposed upon the freedom and the dignity of people created in the image of God. So I hope that people in the class, or that you now found that helpful. Just as one image. Stay tuned now, and I'm going to play for you the two videos that we showed in class. One on the Episcopal view of the incarnation and how that sends us out as evangelists that confidently and theologically have an identity about how to bless the world. And then right after that, there's, like I said, a whiteboard cartoon video that really tries to encapsulate our whole understanding of the Episcopal theology of evangelism and how that looks in the world as a post-colonial, inclusive, joyful form of evangelism.
This This is Embracing Evangelism, a series from Virginia Theological Seminary and the Episcopal Church that helps people to seek and speak of God's loving presence and invite others to share the journey. In this second session, we will explore the importance of seek, name, and celebrate for the practice of evangelism. One of the key words we need to remember as we explore evangelism is incarnation. This term from the Latin carnis literally means enfleshment. It is based on John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. So incarnation is the doctrine that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, the Son of God in the flesh. If we look at the world through the lens of incarnation, we can see how God is still showing up in the flesh all over the place. The world is shot through with holiness and the lively presence of God. We get to see the Holy Spirit moving and going before us into all places, already at work. We can see where the light of God is already present, especially in the people around us, since we're all made in God's image. We become treasure hunters because the treasures of God's presence are all around us. We look for God at work around us, in us, and through us. And surprise, God is there. There in the single mother who returns at the end of a horrendous day at work to be present with her twins. There in the worker who responds with grace to a difficult customer. There in the young person who grieves the loss of friends killed in a mass school shooting, and then transforms her grief to become a powerful voice for ending gun violence. In Jesus, God has promised to show up among us over and over again, not just as an abstract idea, but as the loving presence of God's self. God weeps with us, hopes with us, lays out a dream for creation, and invites us to live it. Because of the reality of incarnation, we can go out with a curious, adventurous, faith-filled way of seeing, seeking, and listening in the world.
As Episcopalians, we promise in our baptismal covenant to seek and serve Christ in all persons. That's a bold statement of faith. We say that we will actively listen for God's presence in others, and we dare to believe God is moving in every person. That is our starting point. Christ is already present. We don't start by assuming that we are the ones who already have God, carrying God's light into a godless world. We don't start with hard-lined, memorized scripts or absolute, fixed formulas. Because we dare to assume that God is already moving and stirring in all people's lives, we start with wonder, with holy curiosity. We start with listening for and seeking Jesus. The Holy Spirit is already present and moving. We just have to catch up. So the starting point of Episcopal evangelism is we seek Christ. In any of our relationships and interactions with others, we become inherently curious, assuming we will find Jesus' loving presence because we trust that the Holy Spirit has gone before us into all places and is at work in every life, including our own lives. So we pay attention. This is a humble practice that requires deep listening and watching. How is God present and at work in this person's life, this person's story? See how different this is than trying to convert someone, selling a formula, or striving to force a change in someone's thinking. Seeking Christ is rooted in trust that Christ is actually present. So it's listening with your antenna up. Once we form habits of seeking, then we can begin naming what we have seen. Words do matter. This is when we put into words what we have seen of God moving in others' lives and in our own lives. It can be so simple. You know, I hear God working through you in your story of how you and your family handled that situation. What a great gift of evangelism, announcing God's goodness and presence in our lives and the lives of those around us. It's like holding up a mirror to let someone know what they may not have seen themselves. Hey, when I see how you care for children in your classroom, it looks like God at work to me. The Spirit of God moves through you the way you're so patient and kind with every customer. I know Jesus held me and guided me when my mother died. Naming is essential. When we name, we're not forcing or shaming others into living as we do. We're simply speaking, without shame or embarrassment on our own part, from our own identities as followers of Jesus. And we do this by naming how we see God in what brings joy, gives hope, and delivers freedom in others' lives and in our own. As we seek and name, we want to be respectful, generous, and humble. We also want to hear how others see and name things from their own perspective. But we do name God's presence and movement as we see it. If we never name God as the one we see, Jesus as the one who brings love and liberation into people's lives every day, then people around us may never know God as the source of love and freedom. There's a wonderful passage in Isaiah 52 that's like a poster for this kind of evangelism. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Seeking and naming Jesus' loving presence in our own lives and the lives of others is not an imposition or something to apologize for. It's actually something beautiful.